Good afternoon. My name is Helen Miller and I'm Assistant Governance Relations at GRI. Welcome to this meeting of the Global Sustainability Standards Board, known by its acronym, the GSSB, held on the 30th of November 2017. This virtual meeting is being hosted from the GRI Secretariat Office in Amsterdam, the Netherlands. Please note that all public GSSB meetings are being recorded, and you can find the audio recording on the GSSB website, along with high-level summaries of previous GSSB meetings. Present from the GRI Secretariat today are Bastian Buck, Director Standards, Laura Espinach, Manager Standards, Anna Krotova, Manager Standards, Jillian Balaban, Assistant Standards, Tina Nybo-Jensen, Senior Coordinator, Governance Relations. We will now start with a roll call. Attila Yerlikaya. Attila, are you on the line? Dwight Justice.
I'm here.
Evan Harvey. Ken Swift.
I'm present.
Kirsten Margrethe Hovey.
I'm present.
Michelle Voscher.
Present.
Nankumar Vadekepat.
Present.
Robin Leeson.
Present.
Stian Vandrach.
Present.
And I'll try again, Attila Yerlikaya. Thank you, everyone. We'll confirm with you, Attila, via email. We would like to note that the GSSB members Sulema Pioli, Daniel Taillon, and Daniel Ingram send their apologies to this meeting. I'll now hand to the chair, Judy Kusevsky, to open the meeting.
Thank you very much for that, Helen, and welcome everyone on the GSSB and from the Standards Division and the Secretariat. Welcome to anyone who might be listening online. I'd like to say a special welcome back to Tina from the Secretariat, who's just returned from her maternity leave, and we're very pleased to have her back. So welcome, Tina.
Thank you, Judy.
One note for the members today. I am speaking to you over the phone rather than through the webcast, so I don't have access to the chat function on the webinar Skype for Business interface. So if you would like to make any comments, please feel free to use the chat function, but I won't be able to see it. So if any comments do come through in that format, I'll rely on the Standards Division to read them out for me. And otherwise, please just speak if you would like to make a comment. That would be great today. Okay, we have a really quite a full agenda, I would say, today. So if we take a look at our agenda, we know that we have to take a look at the summary of the October meeting. We're going to be looking at the updated work program for 2017-2019. Then we have updates from the water and OHS working groups following the public comment period. We're going to be looking at the technical inquiries that are received into the Standards Division, the proposed membership of the Tax Technical Committee. We have a code of conduct that has been proposed for working groups and technical committees. And then we have a few housekeeping items at the end. I have not heard of any other business items that have been raised by any members thus far. So I believe we don't have any that have been proposed at this point. But if anyone would like to speak about anything else, then we'll do that at the very end. Any questions or comments? Okay. If not, then the first item on our agenda. Can I ask now, have we got our quorum? Because if we need to have it for carrying decisions, then we'd better make sure we do that.
Hi, Judy. This is Tina. We are at the moment working on getting hold of Attila again, who dropped off the line.
Okay. Okay. Do we need to have Attila in order to approve the meeting summary from October?
No, you can go ahead with the summary from the latest
Fine.
meeting.
Are there any? Thank you very much, Tina. Are there any? Do any members have any comments or edits that they would like to propose for the summary from the October meeting, 26th of October meeting summary?
Judy, it's Stian. I've gone through it, no comments, and I propose for approval.
Kirsten here. Since I had a comment last time that I thought the minutes was a bit too lengthy, I would just like to say this time that I'm very pleased with the format of this minutes.
This is Bastian. You see the team very relieved here.
Yeah. You should really get praise for this very good approach to the minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Kirsten. That is a very helpful comment. Anyone have any adjustments that they would like to make? And otherwise, I don't believe I'm hearing any objections to the meeting summary. Hearing
just
none.
One comment. It's
sorry.
Not, again, just one comment. It's Kirsten again. Not to the memo itself, not to the minutes itself, but regarding session 6, line 56 and 57. It says that the standards department to schedule a follow-up conversation with the services regarding the methodology of the alignment service. Concept note will be shared when available. I participated in the GRI Pioneers or the Standards Pioneers webinar on Tuesday, and then several new initiatives were presented there, which I haven't seen before. So I'm just asking if this will come up under any other business later in this meeting.
This is Bastian. No, we don't have that for the any other business, and the reason for that is that there is no updated concept note available currently. We have inquired internally, and there is nothing to be shared right now with the GSB for a background conversation. But we will follow up, the aim being to have that presented to you in January, if at all possible, for the colleagues here in the department that runs the services.
Thank you. And then it's a bit confused that they do present these services as new services that will be launched very soon. It's just an observation.
Yes, and we take note of that. We'll also minute this, and we'll bring that back to the responsible people internally.
Thank you, Kirsten. If there are no other comments, then I think we have accepted the to approve the meeting summary of the 26th of October virtual meeting, which means that our next item is session 2, the updated work program. Bastian, would you please like to talk us through this?
Yeah, this is Bastian. We've just been discussing here. We propose to skip actually to the fourth session on summary of technical inquiries for now, because there is nothing in there that needs quorum. We are still aiming to have Attila back on the line, and we would feel more comfortable to have the conversation when he is also attending the meeting. So we will skip to the technical inquiries. Laura will be presenting. Just as a precursor to everything we present, I would just to apologize to the GSSB members for, I think, the first time we were not able to meet the deadline to share documents 10 days in advance. That is largely owed really to the bottleneck that we have right now with being understaffed and also heavily committed to deliver on the standards projects at the same time. And that has put us into a situations where we're late in sharing a substantial part of the documents. Just wanted to apologize for that from the standards division's perspective. And we will move now into the session 4, the summary of the technical inquiries, and that is, I will just skip through the slides very quickly. It is slide number 35 onwards, and Laura will be presenting this item. Thank you.
Thank you. Laura.
Thank you, Bastian and Judy. So we're looking at item 3 from the meeting papers, and this is the standing item in every GSSB meeting where we give an update on the technical inquiries that have come in on the GRI standards since the last GSSB meeting. So we will start with a summary of what are the types of questions that have come in over the last month. And for this meeting, we have identified 3 of those inquiries for discussion. And those are inquiries around whether reasons for omission can be used when making a GRI reference claim, whether the range of entities to report on can vary between disclosures, and feedback that we have received on disclosure 3021 on energy consumption within the organization. In addition to that, we are following up on some of the discussions we had with you in September during the in-person meeting here in Amsterdam. So we will give you an update on the FAQ responses that you discussed in September and the feedback that you gave. And back then, you also asked that we conduct further research on one of those items, on the status of definitions in the GRI standards, and we will be discussing the outcome of that research with you today. So item 3 summarizes the inquiries that have come in between the end of September and the beginning of November, and besides the 3 items that we have flagged for discussion, the other questions that have come in are a bit of the same compared to previous summaries that you have received. So we have received questions around the materiality principle and the clarification that was introduced in the standards, clarifications and questions around topic boundary, how to report on the disclosures in GRI 102, general disclosures, which do not allow reasons for omission and when the company is not able to provide the information, questions around the use of the sector disclosures and when those are going to be updated for the standards, and finally requests for tools, resources, examples, etc. You can find the full overview of inquiries in Annex 1, and you're also welcome to flag any other items for discussion. Claim, and they still want to use selected GRI standards or part of a standard, they are required to make a GRI reference claim. And in order to make that claim, there are certain requirements that need to be met. And one of those requirements is clause 3.3.2, which says that the organization shall comply with all reporting requirements that correspond to the disclosure reported. And that means that in order to make a GRI reference claim, an organization would need to report fully on each disclosure that is reporting on. And reasons for omissions are not really accounted for in the GRI reference claim section. And over the last month, we received a couple of inquiries pointing to the fact that this clause, 3.3.2, is inconsistent with the overall approach of using parts of a standard. Our recommendation would be that given the updates that are taking place at the moment with occupational health and safety in water, for example, we're starting to see that disclosures will become more and more specific and detailed, and it will become more difficult for companies to report fully on a disclosure. So our proposal would be that in order to ensure that there is recognition for the use of the standards and the GRI standards disclosures, even if they have not been reported in full, that the organization be allowed to either use reasons for omission when making a GRI reference claim, or that in the claim the company specifies which parts of a disclosure it has used if the disclosure has not been reported in full. So if a disclosure has 3 parts, A, B, and C, and the company has only reported A and B, the claim would need to specify that only parts A and B of that disclosure have been reported. So that's our recommendation. At the moment, we're just looking for feedback from the GSSB on the general approach outlined here. And following your feedback, we will work on specific text that we will bring for your feedback again in January. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Judy. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. Okay, I think we need to give some feedback on this question here. If memory serves, I think the idea behind the GRI referenced claims was to allow reporters, or at least the scenario that I recall discussing at the time, was one in which a reporter wanted to use a single discrete GRI standard, one or more of them, without doing a so-called GRI report. And that the issue here, in my mind, is really whether this question around using parts of the content is actually valid at all. And I think I'd like to take some discussion from the Standards Board on this, whether or not the kind of bits and pieces approach is what we would like to encourage, or whether we want to sort of hold it to the entirety of standards. Could anyone voice an opinion for me, or let me know if they'd like to make a comment? None?
Well, this is Evan. I'll make a comment.
Please do, Evan.
Having some experience with the GRI protocol as it's evolved over the last few years, I think that anything we can do to make it more engaging and more palatable for companies of all sizes is useful. I think it is a bit of a slippery slope to begin to offer piecemeal dissections of the standards for companies to pick and choose the easy metrics and maybe avoid the ones that might be insightful but more difficult to produce. So I'm a bit of two minds here, but I do think that we should, as this body, have one eye on making these standards as usable as possible by companies of all sizes. One of the things that we run into in my line of work quite often is the even with the simplification of the standards, a lot of companies still feel daunted by it and feel like it's overwhelming, and there is this prevailing expectation that they have to do all of it in order to do any of it, and that may not be contributing to sort of a global data dialogue in a more effective way.
Thank you, Evan. Any other thoughts?
Kirsten is raising her hand.
Oh, yes. Kirsten, please go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, I didn't catch everything Evan said, but at least some of it. And for me, I believe that companies will do this either we allow for it or not. And then it's better to say that if you do it, you must make sure that you are clear on what you have reported and what you have not reported. And especially for beginners, this is a good possibility to be able to report what you are able to report on. And even for the experienced reporters, we see that while certain information is okay to report, or it's easily available, or it's possible to compile, other information will not be possible for that specific company to compile. And instead of them saying, well, we're not able to compile A, B, C, D, E, and F for this disclosure, so then we don't do it, even though we can disclose A to C. I think it's a better report than if A to C is disclosed than if nothing at all is disclosed. Thank you.
I would like, this is Kent, I would like to add my support for the comments by Evan and by Kirsten. I think that if you just look through a lot of sustainability reports, many of them currently are missing, lots of disclosures, and if we don't allow for that, it would seem to me that we would be discouraging a lot of companies that are currently reporting from continuing to report using at least using some part of the GRI standard.
Okay. I mean, I think to be clear, I'm not sure that Evan and Kirsten were making entirely the same point. I don't want to speak for either one of them. But the way that I understood Evan sort of responding to it was that we should work hard to make the standards as user-friendly as they possibly can be, but that it would be a slippery slope for us to introduce the possibility of picking and choosing parts of standards. Whereas Kirsten made a different point, I thought, which was that particularly for beginner reporters, it just simply isn't feasible to expect them necessarily to have the capability to report fully on everything. Now, the extent to which that is actually allowed for in the reasons for omission, which so far don't apply to the GRI reference reports, but do apply to GRI reporting. I don't know if we're talking at cross purposes here or not, but I just wanted to sort of clarify this and to state that I'm not hearing a consensus coming together yet, but I'd very much like to hear from other members on this as well. And please, Evan and Kirsten, if I've said something wrongly, please correct me.
Judy, Michelle would like to comment as well.
Michelle,
yes.
please.
Yes, it's a very short comment. I agree with the recommendation here because sometimes it's simply not possible to report extensively on everything that is required by the disclosure. I'll give a very simple example in the chemical industry. In the chemical industry, recycling byproducts is normal practice. It happens very often, but it means that when something is recycled, it's not labeled as waste. And so in the waste disclosure, when we have to report for waste recycled, for us, it's an oxymoron. And so I think it's needed to allow company to say why they are not disclosing something and explain it very clearly.
But Michelle, using your experience, I mean, you're a full user of the GRI standards as opposed to a reporter wanting to do a GRI reference report. And I'm wondering if there's a difference there, because as I say, there are the reasons for omission that allow for certain scenarios to prevail in GRI reports according to the standards. We don't so far apply the reasons for omission in GRI reference reports, which is, again, to be clear, we've got the in accordance criteria, and then we have this option of GRI reference, and this is for reporters who don't want to do a full GRI report. And if I'm not mistaken, Michelle, in your case, this sounds like an entirely valid kind of scenario, but in your case, that is catered for under the GRI standards. And I'm curious about the situation that, let me back up a little bit. Do we have examples of GRI referenced reports yet to refer to where this may or may not have occurred?
This is Bastian. Yes, we have first examples of GI reference reports, and they use a range of different ways of describing to what extent they have used the standards. And this is a reoccurring issue, that whether or not, once they claim to have reported on a particular disclosure, they can actually also explain situations like the one that Michelle just gave. So that's really, we're seeing that in practice. We don't have statistics on how often that is an issue. That would think about whether it's referenced or it's core in particular. We will have to have an answer in the coming weeks for those audiences.
Okay. I anyway think that it should be made very clear what needs to be disclosed or not, depending on what kind of claim is made.
Sorry, I missed the first couple of words of that, Michelle. Could you just repeat that comment?
Well, what I wanted to say is that, as I said, yes, I agree that there is a range of alignment to the GRI, and it may start from just being inspired by the GRI vocabulary to full alignment with the disclosures. As I said, I think that in any scenario, there will be omissions, some for good reasons, some for bad reasons. And I think it is sound to attract attention on where there is an omission and why.
Okay.
And to allow it.
Mm-hmm.
Judy, Kirsten and Julia
yeah.
would like to raise a point.
Okay, please, Kirsten.
Thank you. I think you summed up my statements quite well, Judy, and thank you also for summing up Evans, because I think I only got what he said about user-friendliness. And for me, this is about making it user-friendly and attractive to start reporting. I have been talking with a few companies lately that are in the process of starting their reporting, and they seem to be quite overwhelmed by the number of standards, etc., even though I'm absolutely sure that being able to relate to a number of standards that can be put together as is material for the company is much better than starting looking into the whole G4 guidelines. But for most of them, they are starting quite from scratch in many cases. And when they enter into a standard that, and with disclosures that are by all means material to them, but they are only able to report on parts of it. I think it's good that they start there, but of course they should be absolutely clear on what they have reported on and what they have not reported on, just to repeat myself. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Julia.
Yes, thanks. I just think, I agree for a GRI report in full. We want to be careful that people aren't, I think as somebody said, sort of cherry picking and answering things that are perhaps easy and not responding to material indicators that are perhaps more difficult. But I do see a lot of value in providing or offering an opportunity to produce GRI referenced claims that companies could perhaps use outside of a GRI report. And I think there's value in that, particularly for companies that are starting out in their reporting journey. And you know, I think Evan has a good point about to the extent that we can reduce the perceived burden, real or perceived burden of reporting for companies that are earlier in their journeys. I think that's a positive, you know, perhaps starting out with GRI reference claims in their most particularly material areas before they launch into a full report could be a welcome, you know, opportunity for some.
Okay, so I think I probably want to call the question then. And first of all, could I just do a little process check here, because we have spent quite a bit of time on just this one question, and there are rather a lot of them, and I don't know if we have our quorum on the line for some of the other elements yet. Could I have an update from the Secretariat on that, please?
Yes, Judy, this is Tina. I can give you an update. If I can just reference a part of the GSSB terms of reference, then the publication of an exposure draft or the approval of an authoritative pronouncement shall require approval by a minimum of 80% of the members of the GSSB at the time of approval. Other decisions of the GSSB, including the publication of a discussion paper, shall require a simple majority of the members present when a meeting of the GSSB is called. And the approval items during these meetings do not require 80% of the members of the GSSB, but quorum, and we do have that at the moment when we have 11 GSSB members present.
Well, I understand that. Thank you, Tina. I mean, as far as this particular discussion of the technical queries is concerned, we're okay.
Yes.
My concern is about our larger agenda today, and I'd be happy to spend lots of time on the technical inquiries section if we didn't have the quorum that we would need in order to talk through the water and OHS and the work plan, sorry, we don't need it for the work plan, but I just wanted to know, so are you confirming we don't have the full quorum for the water and OHS update?
We do have quorum.
So we don't have quorum, okay, but we have quorum, and we have a simple majority which is needed for the decisions today. So while it is probably more comfortable to always have the quorum, it is technically, based on the terms of reference, possible to move all the approvals that we have tabled today with the number of people that are now on the call, provided that nobody drops out at this stage. Okay. So we can go ahead. Okay. What I suggest is we've collected quite some feedback on this particular matter now. I think that gives us enough a direction. Laura will present the rest of this item, and then we move into the other sessions. I think we spent 10 more minutes on this here, and then we go back to the regular schedule.
Well, that's fine with me. That's fine with me. But I think we need to get some clear direction on this particular one. If I could just ask the question, as far as the SD recommendation is concerned, there's an either or that's presented here. Allow the organization to use reasons for omission or to clearly indicate in the claim if a disclosure has not been fully reported on. Are these two options, or are we approving that either or as a recommendation? Because to my mind, if we allow reasons for omission on GRI referenced reports, that is no more or less than what we permit for GRI in accordance reports. If on the other hand, we allow GRI reference reports to simply indicate that the disclosure has not been fully reported on, but it is still legitimately a GRI referenced report, then that, to my mind, introduces a different category of flexibility. If I'm the only person who has this concern, then probably I should stand down on it. But yeah.
Judy, just to clarify, so it is indeed it's two options in a way. The first one is just to go with the reasons for omissions as they are outlined and make them applicable for the GI referenced approach, basically, or option. The second one is a bit more nuanced, is since they have to write a claim statement as part of that claim statement, we would actually then set out that they have to explain which components of a disclosure they specifically have reported. Right now, what we see in the claim statements, they refer to a disclosure without saying clearly which of the elements have been reported. And these are two. So what that wouldn't give us is the reason for omission, that additional information, the explanation. That's the difference between the two. You can think of a continuum and a level of detail, and here, and it's indeed two different options.
Right. Okay. So again, I don't want to spend an enormous, great deal more time on this one question, but I personally don't feel that I have clarity in my mind as to, given that these are two different options, which of the options the people on the call have been speaking in favor of or against. So I would either, I would recommend that we either clarify that now, or we perhaps table this one simply because we have so much to get through today.
Can I make a suggestion? Can I make a suggestion, Judy? I think when I had to summarize the comments that we heard, I think there's general agreement that we should continue to promote the GRI reference claim as an easy entry to use of the GRI standards. And in that vein, it is probably better to actually look at the second option that we have here and say that in the claim that they're making, they're just indicating specifically what they have reported, and they don't have to use the reasons for omissions. The reason for omissions with all the detailed explanation would only kick in with core or comprehensive. And the reason for that, I think, from the perspective of the board, could be that transparency is served with the first one. They cannot overstate what they're doing. They have to be specific. But at the same time, there is no burden to go into any level of detail to explain why certain things are not reported, which is probably not adequate given that it is just a referenced claim. If that is that an option that we can test and a reasoning that we can test, and we could write it up then for the January meeting?
Yeah. So then we would boil it down to the second option that's listed here.
Yes, indeed.
Rather than presenting both.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Can we do that then?
Yes, we can do that.
That up in January. Shall we then spend the next few minutes going as quickly as we can through the other the questions in the standards inbox and so forth? Laura?
We're looking at time, Judy. We have now 45 minutes almost into the call, and we had scheduled 30 for this. We can maybe return to this item later on. I'm just checking whether we have an additional member joining in the meanwhile, or no. There is no update on that. So we go back to the item, the first substantive item on the agenda, which is the work program.
Yes, please. That's fine with me. Yeah.
And what we're doing here is basically what you have in front of you as item 2 is the version of the work program that we have written up based on the discussions we had at the September in-person meeting, where I have presented the work program, also the rationale behind the different items in the work program, and you have provided feedback that was documented in the meeting summary for the in-person meeting, and we have now updated the work program that was approved last year with the feedback received from you. Why we've waited with sharing this with you was in particular a discussion on when we can be more specific about start dates for one of the major deliverables here, the sector program, and that is, as you well know, a funding-related discussion that is still pending. We here from the Standards Division had hoped that we could actually also be more indicative with a indication of the quarter of 2018 when we can start the sector program. That's not possible because there are still funding-related issues to be resolved. That's the only other matter that I would like to highlight here. There's no addition to the work program over and above what we have discussed in the September meeting. And I would like to then also open this up for the GSB members to share any feedback that they have still on this document. Thank you.
Okay, any discussion or feedback on the updated work program?
Judy, I've reviewed it and I'm in support of it. It's Stian speaking.
Thank you, Stian. Thank you, Stian. Yeah, given that we had a lengthy discussion of this in October, I'm not too surprised that there's not a lot of discussion of it now. Bastian, are there specific questions that you expected to have more feedback on?
No. I think we've discussed that at the September meeting. There wasn't a specific issue that I wanted to highlight, and again, there is no change or addition over and above what we have discussed in September.
Okay.
Kirsten, here. I'm just wondering if there are any progress to the development of new guidance for specific groups of reporters, the point F, item F in the work program.
So what I had shared in the September meeting is that we explored in particular that avenue of having SME-specific guidance and that a program is underway, actually a grant-funded program with GRI overall, where we look at SME reporting. That we have, in terms of first signals from the market, that the standards seem to be better suited than the G4 guidelines to bring SMEs into the reporting, the GRI reporting, and that we would wait more for feedback from the programming that we have, the grant-funded programming, to decide whether or not an SME-specific guidance is needed. There is no other particular group right now that we have singled out, but we are, I think, closely watching the uptake, and in particular also with the grant-funded programming of GRI, we have a number of the emerging economies covered, where we look at very specifically what are the needs of reporters. So that might come up in the future. It is not right now that we have identified and singled out a specific group where specific guidance is needed at this stage. So in short, we're monitoring, but we haven't singled out a specific group.
Any other questions? Okay, hearing none, I think, Bastian, it is simply a question of our thanks to you and the Standards Division team for putting this together, and it seems to be that we are happy with this and can release it as our official document. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. The next step is then that we will share it also with the GRI board and the SC, and we will look at making it publicly available with the invitation for stakeholders to also react to it. That's the practice that we've started last year. We will
What's the time frame for doing that? And is there a public comment, as it were, process?
No, there is. Well, we will have to decide how much time we give to stakeholder council and board. Given that we are towards the end of the year, we'll probably ask them to get back to us by the end of January. Yeah. And with the public, we can extend it a bit more. It would be interesting, I believe, that we have feedback from the wider public at hand for our in-person meeting early April next year. That would be the right moment to also then look at the work program again with an eye on 2020 and actually 2021 already, probably in terms of programming. Yeah, I leave it at that, and I hand over to Anna and Laura for the presentation on the progress for the two project working groups.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bastian. Thank you, Judy. Good afternoon, the GSSB.
This is Dwight. Can you hear me?
Yes, Dwight, we can hear you.
Does this next item require a decision?
This we're looking at water and effluent. Yes, I believe it does.
Okay.
Anna?
Yes. So the objectives of the session today is really to share the overview of all the changes that we have made to the draft based on the, in response to public feedback and further consultations with the project working group, as well as present the process for re-exposure to you and outline the next steps and actions, some actions that we require from the GSSB. I'd like to first give you an overview of the structural changes that we've made to the standard. So we first separated the water consumption disclosures from water withdrawal disclosures into a discrete disclosure, and this is in response to public feedback to improve the feasibility of reporting in full on at least one of the components of this disclosure. We have removed disclosure on spills and leaks, as we have received feedback that the impacts from spills and leaks cover much broader impacts than just water, and therefore water may not be the right standard for this particular topic. And we will develop a proposal for a standalone standard on how to report spills and leaks, and we will talk about it a little bit later in the presentation. We have relocated the contents from disclosure on impacts on the supply chain and related to products and services throughout the standard. So we have moved the requirements from this disclosure to the management approach disclosures, and we have moved recommendations to respective disclosures. And it's important to note that these structural changes did not lead to any change in the status of these contents. So these are required to be reported or recommended to be reported just as they were. And so now the structure of the standards looks as follows. We have 3 key disclosures on withdrawal, discharge, and consumption. And these also provide a clear and much more straightforward representation of the key components of water use and impacts of water use. We haven't made that many changes to the management approach disclosures. So first of all, we have expanded on narratives for how organizations should report information about their water quality standards, including whether they have defined internal quality standards or they're used international water quality standards, whether they have considered any sector-specific parameters. And we have also clarified that companies should or can report any other additional information about their management and water stewardship practices beyond what is required in the standard, such as, for example, efficiency or intensity metrics, which we haven't included in the standard separately. So as a result of separating water consumption disclosures, the disclosure on water withdrawal now has 3 requirements, which is to report withdrawal from water-stressed areas, from all areas, followed by reporting any contextual information necessary to understand how this data have been compiled. We have added a 5th source to report water withdrawals, which is produced and processed water, as this is highly relevant to some sectors. We have, again, as the result of relocating contents from disclosure on the supply chain, we have added a recommendation to report total volume of withdrawn water by suppliers from water-stressed areas. Again, exactly the same as it was formulated in the disclosure 3034. We have also clarified, and as you have remembered in the standard, we require companies to assess water-stressed areas using publicly available methodologies and tools. However, companies have asked us and requested to clarify that they can also use their own assessments should they wish to make more granular and detailed assessments of water stress in areas, and we have provided that or made that provision in the standard. We have also clarified that if a company's main source of water supply is a third party, such as, for example, a municipal supplier, then the company is required to request information about the original sources of this water, and this is would allow for this industry to better understand the original sources of their water withdrawal. And we have also added a method to calculate water that is recycled and reused, simply to allow for comparability of data. So there is now one formula in the standard that all organizations can use. Kirsten has a question about the method for how to calculate recycled and reused water. So this is a formula which calculates the percentage of water recycled and reused, where the numerator is total water recycled and reused, and then the denominator is the sum of total water recycled and reused and water withdrawal, and this is multiplied by 100. And this formula, or the results of this calculation, allows to understand how much water demand was met by, or met with water that was reused and recycled. We have made quite a lot of changes to water discharge disclosures. So during public comment, one of our key questions was to understand whether reporters thought it was more feasible and meaningful to report discharges by either levels of treatment or levels of quality. And as a result of feedback, we have focused all of our water discharge disclosures on quality. As a result of this, we have moved reporting discharge by treatment to a recommendation, as well as narratives about how these treatment levels were determined. We have moved reporting impacts from surface runoff to water discharge disclosures, as this is slightly more relevant in here, and we have also removed reference to surface runoff to the agricultural sector to make it more generic and applicable to all sectors where surface runoff occurs. We have added the recommendation to report percentage of suppliers that have set minimum standards for the quality of their water discharge, again as a result of relocating supply chain disclosures. There were a lot of comments around reporting substances of concern and how companies would not be able to list all the possible substances that they have and discharge limits against these. So we have first of all, define the term substances of concern and what we mean under these in the context of the water standard in particular. And we have clarified that only priority substances of concern are required to be reported, as well as we added a clause asking companies to explain how these priority substances were identified and whether any authoritative standards were used, etc. And we have also added a clause for companies to explain their really company-wide approach for setting discharge limits to these identified priority substances of concern. And finally, we added a requirement to report incidents of non-compliance for water discharges, including discharge limits set for substances of concern. So as you can see, we've moved away from really asking a lot of data points that not necessarily tell us about the impact of this data reported, more into understanding really what are the processes and the approaches that a company has to regulating these critical components of water discharge. Kristen, I see your comment in the chat, and yes, I will share the description with you after the meeting. And then water consumption, which is now a discrete disclosure, has 3 requirements, which is to report consumption from water-stressed areas, from all areas, and report any contextual information that was necessary to understand how this data has been compiled. We have removed the reference to the original source from the definition of water consumption, and this was done to allow a valid calculation of water consumption, so to align the definition with the calculation method that we have proposed in the draft. We have also slightly adjusted the calculation method to allow to account for change in storage for companies who who keep a lot of water in storage, but they do not use this water and they do not discharge this water. So we are allowing for an accurate calculation of consumption for sectors where this is relevant. And again, we have added a recommendation to report the volume of water that was consumed by suppliers located in water-stressed areas. The recommendation to report spills, the disclosure to report spills and leaks at the moment is removed from the standard, and the feedback that we have received, and which was also supported by the project working group, is that spills, impacts from spills and leaks cover a much broader scope of areas than just water. So they affect biodiversity, they affect land if leaks happen from waste. They have impact on air emissions, and so what we suggest is that, and so the definition also of spills and leaks that we have in the standard really covers all of these areas. So it's not really the right place for this topic to only be reported in the water standard. So therefore, we will develop a proposal for a standalone standard on spills and leaks, which can then be cross-referenced to the GRI, but also to all other standards, existing GRI standards where this is relevant. And Bastian is here with me,
Yeah.
Maybe wants to add.
Maybe just to add to that, so this is upon reflection on the concept of spills and leaks and their relevance to a whole host of standards going forward. There is one of these standards that probably will have to be referenced across a range of the already existing standards to be revised, but potentially also a whole range of standards that we will be adding to the mix going forward. Spills and leaks is a concept that is cross-sectorial, I would say, with more relevance for some sectors than for others. But it has traditionally always been a focused standard or focused element in the GI offering, and what we want to avoid with the proposal that we're putting to you here is that we start to define spills and leak as issue specific across a range of standards, replicating probably very similar metrics with a bit of nuance. While it is much better to set out spills and leaks once and then cross-referencing into other topic standards to pick up that information going forward. The working group, again, here for water was behind that concept because they had also a range of practice examples where spills and leaks and the way they are discussed by reporters extend beyond the boundary of water, and oftentimes also the reverse holds true, that sometimes there are spills and leaks that are contextualized in a specific subject area, but in actual fact they also pertain to water in the end, and that can be probably best addressed in a standalone standard going forward. So we're flagging here that next to what we already mentioned early on, that we will work on a standard that takes care of the effluents. We will also write a proposal for a standalone standard on spills and leaks going forward. And then there will be a question that we still have to determine how much involvement that needs from experts, whether it's a technical committee or a project working group. That remains to be seen, but we will come back next year to you with that.
Bastian, sorry to interrupt. This is Daniel. I'm sorry I had some technical difficulties this morning. I've just been able to join the call.
Perfect. Welcome, Daniel. Thank you.
Daniel.
So given the scope of these changes, the Standards Division proposes to re-expose the full standard for 60 days for another public comment between December and February 2018. So the revised, what we propose is to post the revised standard on the GRI standards website and announce this through our regular communication channels, just as we did for the previous public comment. So any interested party will be able to give their feedback. We will also specifically reach out to all of the participants of the previous public comment to provide feedback again if they wish to. And we're also considering a possibility to hold a specific peer review call with some of the respondents from the first public comment, just to discuss some of the topics in detail, but this is not confirmed. So the question we have to the GSSB is whether the GSSB agrees with this approach and agrees with the full re-exposure of the draft. And Judah, I will pass it on to you for coordinating with the GSSB.
Thank you, Anna. The one question that I would have would be to do with the idea that the whole of the new standard would be re-exposed for 60 days. I guess that's simply because the range of the changes that have taken place across the standards has been very broad, such that it would be impractical to re-expose only particular parts. Would that be correct?
Yes, it's the range of the issues, but also these issues are so connected. These disclosures are so connected with each other.
Indeed. Yes.
Are so connected between each other that it's really difficult to. It would be. I think unwise and impractical to really expose, let's say, one disclosure that has been significantly changed, but then not expose the other.
Understood. Yeah. Thank you. Okay, Standards Board, any questions or comments with respect to the outlined approach that Anna has presented to us? To look at the next slide, which has the re-exposure timeline on it, so that everybody could understand what effect this re-exposure have on the finalization time frame.
Sure. So what we propose at the moment is that we have our next call, our final call with the project working group this year, next week, Wednesday, where we aim to approve the draft standard for the content of the draft standard to be re-exposed, and then we will aim to re-expose on the 20th of December, between the 19th of February 2018. And on the next slide, I have some actions for the GSSB, but looking a little bit beyond. So on the 22nd of February, we will be able to update the GSSB on the preliminary feedback from re-exposure. And then on the 22nd of March, we will be able to update you on the latest changes to the draft, and these will also be after the revision of the project working group and their final revision of the draft. So this will be really the final standard. And then you will have time to review this, and we are still aiming to vote on or to approve the standard during your April meeting here in Amsterdam.
Yeah. Okay. So, members, any queries about this process or concerns? Okay, I'm not hearing any. So, Anna, would you like to tell us what we have to do then in the coming weeks?
Yes, just to read out the comments from the chat is that Kirsten agrees with the recommendation, and Michelle also agrees with this recommendation. Okay, great. So then for the
Thank you.
For what we like to request from the GSSB is that we will share the re-exposure draft with you by the 11th of December, and you will have time until the 14th of December really to look at it for any fatal flaw checking, and then we will communicate the process for how to approve the standard or vote on the standard by email when we send the draft on the 11th of December. So this is the really the key steps for you. So please, I guess, book your time to look at the standard early next week.
And just to add to that, Sebastian, we will devise a process for approving it by email individually, just to flag up to members that we will put the email trail also in the public domain, just to evidence that this has moved through all the appropriate steps as per due process.
And then the implications.
Okay, thank you. So, members, that is. Sorry.
Sorry, no, I wanted to. Yes. Judy, go ahead.
Right. Okay. So that means, members, the 11th of of December will be the latest date by which we will receive the proposed re-exposure draft for our approval, and we are requested to review and finally give that approval by email according to a specified format that the Standards Division will put together by the 14th of December. So if you would kindly just make note of that timing. It is an awkward time of year for everybody, but at this point, given all of the discussion, it shouldn't require a great deal of further review by the GSSB. So thank you very much for all of that. Sorry, Anna, would you like to just close off?
Yes, I have one last slide about the implications for other standards. So during your meeting on the 22nd of January, what we will share with you is the project proposal on revising the waste and materials-related disclosures, and also the proposal for developing a standard on spills and leaks. But this is all for your 22nd of January meeting, so no actions at the moment. All right, I will pass it on to Laura now for updates on the OH&S draft. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. So as with water, what we want to do during this session is to share the complete overview of changes that are being made to reporting requirements in GRI 403, Occupational Health and Safety, as a result of public feedback and working group discussions over the last few weeks, and to also discuss the need for re-exposure before the approval of the final standard. Unlike water, I can flag up front that our recommendation, based also on discussions with the GSSB sponsors, would be that re-exposure of the contents would not be needed before the approval of the final standard. We will come to the rationale for that at the end of the presentation, but please keep that in mind as we go through the changes to the standard. So starting with the management approach disclosures, the only key change to a requirement in this section is that recommendation 1.3.3 from the exposure draft has now been made a requirement. And this requirement covers cases where there is no control over the work or the workplace, but the organization is directly linked to an impact via its business relationships. And in those cases, the organization would be required to describe its approach to preventing and mitigating those impacts and the health and safety hazards identified. So this content is very much in line with GRI 103, the management approach standard, and the topic boundary. So the changes described here wouldn't constitute a significant change with the approach that we have already defined for the GRI standards. And important to note as well is that in these cases, we wouldn't require detailed quantitative data on injuries and illnesses. It's just a description of the approach to preventing and mitigating the impacts and the health and safety hazards identified. Moving on to the first topic-specific disclosure, 403.1, on the percentage of workers covered by an occupational health and safety management system. Here we have made two changes to the reporting requirements. The first change is that the disclosure is now limited to only those management systems that are based on recognized standards. So before we were covering any kind of management system that a company may have, but based on the public feedback, the working group has recommended that this be limited to only those management systems based on recognized standards, since that will lead to better comparisons between organizations. And the second change is that in addition to the percentage, we also require the absolute data, so the number of workers covered by the management system, and that is in line with one of the recommendations in GRI 101 Foundation, that whenever normalized data is provided, the absolute data should be reported as well. Moving on to the next disclosure on work-related injuries, here we have made a number of changes and clarifications. The first change is a new requirement to report the list of the main types of work-related injury that took place during the reporting period. Important to note that this is already required in the existing occupational health and safety standard from 2016, and it will be now consistent with the equivalent disclosure that we have on illnesses, where the list of the main types of illnesses is also required in that disclosure. We have clarified that commuting incidents are not included. They are not considered work-related injuries, except when the transport is fully provided by the reporting organization. The rates of fatal injuries and non-fatal impairments have now been separated. Before, we were including these two types of injuries into one rate, and the feedback was that it would be more useful to separate these two rates. And finally, on this slide, we have now enabled more flexibility regarding the methodology for calculating the injury rates, and organizations can now use either the 200,000 or the 1 million hours worked methodology for calculating the injury rates, and they need to state which of the two they have used in the report.
Excuse me, Laura, can I ask a question?
Sure, please go ahead.
On this question of commuting incidents, in a lot of places, the accidents going to and from work are usually, well, in a lot of places, they are treated as work accidents, and I'm wondering what was the nature? How many people made this proposal to change, and what was the working groups, the technical committee's approach in dealing with the proposal?
Thank you, Dwight. Sure. So this clarification was widely supported by the working group. So I just want to clarify that commuting incident is an incident that takes place between a private place, such as a home, restaurant, or any other place of private activity for the worker, and the place of work or the workplace. Only when that is, the transport is provided by the organization, that would be considered a work-related injury. Now, in the guidance to this disclosure, we acknowledge that in some jurisdictions, commuting incidents need to be accounted for. And what we recommend in the guidance is that if that is the case, that commuting incidents be reported, but separately. So not included within the number of total work-related injuries. Now, next to that, in the standard, within the definitions of work-related injuries, we also cover other business travel-related incidents. Travel that is required by the reporting organization. And those incidents will be counted as work-related if the injury takes place at the time where the worker was engaged in work on behalf of the reporting organization. Would you have any concerns? Yep.
Discussion around this issue, and it was very clear that there are two sections to reporting of travel-related injuries. The one is traveling from your home to the workplace. The other one is traveling for work purposes. And the general consensus was to separate the two and include the injuries incurred by traveling for work purposes. Let's say Judy is currently traveling for her work to a place, be it on a train, on an aeroplane, on a car, that will be counted in your incident rate. But traveling from your home to the workplace and back from the workplace to home will not be counted in the injury rate of the company, although the companies are encouraged to report separately on the two.
Well, just so you understand my concern, is I think under what people think are the most common situations, I think there's no problem. But there are situations where work is performed in different locations and it moves from time to time, and therefore the involvement of traveling to a work site, because it changes, in some cases the travel might be more dangerous than in other cases. And you can't necessarily deal with this. And so I'm thinking mainly of work performed in constantly changing workplaces and the travel involved in that, which is less possible to control, and therefore the travel and the dangers of the travel are more intrinsic to the nature of the work.
So Dwight, if I can just suggest an example of what I think you might be talking about, would you include the sort of telephone repair person who spends the entire day driving a van from one site to the next, conducting repairs, all of it on behalf of the telephone company? Would that be an example?
Under certain circumstances, it would be.
Okay.
Also, a person that cleans, a house cleaner would be going to different workplaces.
Yeah, so those cases would be included. Yeah, just to clarify.
They would be
those would,
yeah, because the
right. Those would not be separate as far as kind of as what we would think of as commuting.
Okay.
Is that right?
Well, if what I will do then is I will take a look at the guidance, because presumably there is guidance on this.
Yes, we can share that with you. And just another note that we have aligned this section with the US OSHA methodology, and there's quite a lot of detail in the guidance section. We can share that with you, and you can let us know if that covers your points. Yeah.
I just want to put a marker down right now, and I will promise to take a look at it.
Okay, thank you. Kirsten, do you have a comment?
Yeah, Laura has answered to it mostly, but I would just like to add that, yes, we have been concerned about that, or the work group has been concerned about that. And I fully agree to Dwight's concerns, but I do believe that they should be properly covered within the draft. Thank you.
Thank you, Kirsten. So continuing on the changes to the work-related injuries disclosure, there's been a couple of clarifications to the requirement to report on the causes of fatal injuries and non-fatal impairments. The first change is that instead of asking for the causes of each single incident, which may reveal sensitive information about individual workers or cases, we now simply require the predominant causes that led to fatal injuries and non-fatal impairments. And there's also guidance developed that if some of the predominant causes reveal sensitive information, the organization may make use of the reasons for omission. And finally, that actions taken may include also actions that are underway and that have not been completed at the end of the reporting period, and that's particularly for those incidents or injuries that have occurred close to the end of the reporting period and for which an action, corrective action, may not have been fully implemented yet. And finally, on work-related injuries, we had the metric on the number of high-potential incidents. This is one of the metrics which we anticipated may need significant revisions based on the public feedback. And this is an item that has been the subject of lengthy discussion with the working group over the last few weeks. So to sum it up, the feedback that came in from the public was that the concept of high potential incidents was unclear, subjective, and that the number would potentially penalize those companies that are perhaps more mature and that have better recording systems. What the working group concluded was that the focus on the number of incidents would perhaps not be the most useful for report readers, and that what we're trying to get at here with this metric is to understand what a company is doing to prevent incidents. And in order to understand that, a focus on the systems that are in place and the improvements that a company is making to prevent incidents in the future would be perhaps more appropriate. So the recommendation of the working group is that the number of high potential incidents becomes a recommendation, so not a requirement, and that instead we add 2 additional requirements, one on the policy or approach to investigate occupational health and safety incidents and to identify root causes and determine corrective actions. And the second, a description of any occupational health and safety improvements made during the reporting period in response to near misses or potential incidents.
Yeah, this is Dwight. My concern here is only with the clarity of language. Is the phrase high potential incidents defined or described elsewhere?
Yeah, so we have definitions for most of the terms here on the slide. We define incident, which can be with actual injury or illness or with the potential for injury and illness. We have a definition for near miss, which is any incident with a potential for injury and illness. And then the high potential incidents is a subset of the near misses, which could have led to a serious injury or illness. And all of these terms are defined. We try to align always with either the ILO or the ISO standard, and there's additional guidance and examples provided. We can again share this for your review and comments following the call today.
Okay.
Next, on disclosure 4033, work-related illnesses, there's been no real changes to the requirements here, but we do have clarified the scope or the approach to reporting on work-related illnesses based on public feedback. There was a large set of comments through the public comment pointing to the challenges of reporting work-related illnesses for workers who are not employees and also for employees. And the working group had a specific subgroup call and dedicated to this issue. They went through all of the different challenges that were cited through the public comment. And what they concluded, and just wanted to point out that the ILO was also part of that discussion, was that the working group acknowledges the challenges related to the reporting work-related illnesses, but they highlighted that those challenges are not really related to the status of the worker, so whether the worker is an employee or not, or whether the worker is temporary or permanent. The challenges are inherent to reporting work-related illnesses in itself. So the challenges are really with first detecting that there is an illness, secondly, determining that the illness is work-related, and finally, that the company gets notified of that illnesses. And those challenges apply equally to both employees and other workers. What the working group advised is that the requirement remains unchanged, but that we acknowledge within the guidance the different challenges with reporting work-related illnesses. And although a company may not be able to identify all of the work-related illnesses, that as soon as an illness gets notified to the company, there should be an obligation for that company to report on that illness publicly. So what we will be clarifying in guidance is that this disclosure covers all illnesses that the organization has been notified of or that the organization has identified through medical surveillance and which have been determined to be work-related by a professional. And that can include illnesses notified for an employee, a worker, or even a former employee or worker. And the company would have the option to explain in the report if they believe that the illness is not related to work or not as a result of exposure whilst working for the company, especially for those employees or workers who work for multiple organizations throughout the reporting period. Services, we have made 2 changes to the reporting requirements. The first change is that the percentage of workers that have access has now been replaced by a narrative disclosure on whether and why any workers don't have access to occupational health services and how the organization facilitates workers' access to those services. And the rationale for that was that the expectation included in the ILO convention is that all workers should have access to those services, and that what would be, so that's the basic expectation, and what would be more useful is just for the organization to explain whenever any workers don't have access to those services. And the second change to the requirements is a new requirement to describe the types of occupational health services provided and which help address the health hazards and risks identified in the earlier disclosures and how the quality of those services is ensured. So here trying to provide a bit more context as to which specific services are provided, since there are many different types of services that an organization could provide. And finally, on disclosure 4035, worker health promotion, there's been 3 changes to requirements. The first change is similar to the one we've just discussed. So the percentage of workers that have access to those programs has now been replaced with a narrative on whether and why any workers don't have access and how the organization facilitates workers' access to those services, for example, by providing those services or programs within the workplace, or by allowing workers to access those services during paid working hours. We also have added, in addition to the description of any voluntary programs provided, which was already required in the draft, we also now require a list of the health risks that are specifically targeted by those programs. And finally, one of the recommendations in the exposure draft, 2.67, for this disclosure has now been made a requirement. This is consistent with the Sustainable Development Agenda and one of the targets on achieving universal health coverage, and also based on feedback from the working group that a healthy worker is a worker who has access to both occupational and non-occupational health services. So within this disclosure, it is also required to describe whether the organization provides workers with access to non-occupational medical and healthcare services and the coverage provided.
Yeah, this is Dwight. This is, I think, a little complicated. I make no secret that I've always been concerned about whether the issue of the kinds of non-occupational health services that are provided workers should even be in this in the scope of this area. But assuming that that is all right, I still am concerned that the description is not sufficient to understand what we're actually talking about and to also limit the scope. But the phrase I'm concerned about is non-occupational medical and health care services. And one of the concerns is how is that distinguished from the employer as part of compensation providing medical and health care for the worker and the family, versus the kind of programs that I think people understand is being discussed here, such as a smoking cessation program or something like that. So I'm not sure that there's enough of a description here that is sufficient to make it clear what we're talking about.
Thank you, Dwight. So this disclosure covers all services and programs that are non-occupational, and there are two types that we cover here. So one are worker health promotion programs, so smoking cessation, physical activity, etc. And the other type are non-occupational medical and healthcare services. And the title of this disclosure has now been revised accordingly. But as you read through the disclosure and the guidance, it should be clear that within this disclosure, we're talking about two separate things. And the reason why they are together is because they are non-occupational programs or services. We can work on the wording, and if you have any better suggestions, we've worked very closely with the working group on this, but if there are better references for us to use, we will be happy to have a look at those.
Well, my concern is just the clarity. My original, when I looked at the phrase, it wasn't clear to me, and the scope seemed to be a little broad. But now what I'm hearing from you is that, in fact, it is broad. And so what I'd like to do is read the guidance and see if it's sufficiently clear.
Yeah, definitely. So to close off, based on the changes that we have presented to you today, our recommendation would be that selective re-exposure of contents, as we had anticipated at the last meeting, would not be needed prior to the approval of the final standard. And the reason for that is that most of the changes that we have presented to you today aim to simplify the disclosures, for example, by replacing quantitative metrics with narrative explanations. Many of the changes aim to simply clarify the existing contents or require additional contextual information which is needed in order to fully understand the performance of an organization. And all of these changes should not substantially affect the data collection systems or change the intent of the disclosures as included in the exposure draft. So based on this and upon consultation with the GSSB sponsors for this project, Stian and Kirsten, our recommendation to you today for discussion would be that we move ahead with finalizing the draft standard based on the public comment and input from the working group and yourselves, and that we present the final standard to you for approval in March or April as planned. However, as noted at the last meeting, the GSSB is still required by its due process to vote on the need for re-exposure after the approval of the final standard. So with that, I'll turn it over to you. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Laura. Could I just ask for a little clarification of that due process requirement? It doesn't seem to be obviously sensible that we would have to vote on the need for re-exposure after we've approved a final standard, but rather before we've approved a final standard. So I'm just curious about what that sequencing and whether I'm not understanding that properly.
Yeah, this is Bastian. So if you recall, last year when we approved the standards, we actually went through this procedure, abiding to the due process and how it is set out there. And I think we agreed after having done that that the sequencing is not quite right. I think it is just another positive affirmation of the fact that the GSB sees no reason to re-expose the contents, but is happy with what they've approved. So it's a double approval, if you will. And it is actually, we checked back then, it is actually in line with how it is run in other standard setting processes as well. Maybe as part of the future governance document review, we should be looking at clarifying this formulation. When you read it out here on the slide, it is confusing. It's even more confusing, I think, in the terms of reference. But the intent is, I think, to just signal very clearly that the GSSB has assessed the need for re-exposure and they don't see it, and to have a public record of that notion. It's a bit unfortunate, the formulation, I think.
It is odd, and perhaps we would just add it to the kind of if there is to be a review of governance procedures at any point in the future, maybe we just make note of this as something that doesn't strike us necessarily as entirely sensible in its construction, but at any rate, I think we can live with it. So I guess then we have the question for the GSSB as to any discussion of the proposal by the Standards Division and by the working group for that matter as to forwarding this now into accepting this recommendation regarding the need for re-exposure for the time being and going ahead as planned. Is that are there any? I'm sorry, I'm not saying that very.
Question, because it is a little unclear for me, but basically I raised three concerns, and I'm going to examine certain things that will be sent to me. Where does this come in if in fact my concerns still remain?
Yeah, Laura, we don't have on this one, we don't have the timeline slide for this. Can you tell us what happens at this point?
So at this point, we're still working through all of the changes that the working group has discussed, and we are implementing those in the draft. The draft will then go next week to the working group for a detailed review of the changes online. And after that, in January, we will continue the work with the working group to finalize and refine the draft standard. So, in parallel to that, we can work with interested GSSB members to work on specific sections. So Dwight and anyone else interested, we can reach out to you right after this meeting and share those sections that are relevant to you so that we can incorporate your comments before the draft is sent to the full GSSB for comments around February or March. So at the moment, we're probably planning to share the draft with you around February or March for an initial review before we submit the final standard for approval at the April meeting.
And will there be another meeting of the technical committee, a virtual meeting?
So we have 2 meetings planned at the moment as placeholders, one in January and one in February, which will be used as needed. The next step for the working group is to revise the draft in detail offline between December and January. So if there are any substantive issues from the GSSB over the next few weeks, there are 2 opportunities to discuss this with the project working group, either in January or February.
Okay.
The question is
whether... So we're not voting on final language right now?
No, we're not voting on final language. The question that I would have is whether your concerns would require re-exposure of any contents in the standard, or whether you would be happy to work your comments on the text without those having to go for re-exposure.
I think my major concerns, and there were 3, mainly involved clarification and also to see if the guidance was made some of my questions sufficiently clear. So I wasn't really, I think it's quite possible that I would be satisfied without a need for exposure, but I still imagine that there might be some wordsmithing.
Dwight, if I can just come in here. The one issue that I raised through the technical working committee and with Laura and the team is that exactly that what you propose is crucial to the success of the standard, and that is so that the user of the standard has got no issue around understanding exactly what they need to report. And I've asked them to make sure that the proofreader that they use, and including people like you, are volunteering to do that, make sure that there is absolute clarity in the mind of the user of the standard at the end of the day.
Well, good.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Laura. Let us take a look at the agenda now, just to try to see what we've gotten through and what we still need to get through. Could I ask, Bastian, would you like to make a proposal as to the remaining 20 minutes or even less than 20 minutes that we have on this call right now?
Yes.
Would you like to table the whole of the technical inquiries for the time being, for example, or what?
No, I'm proposing to move to sessions 5 and 6 now for the approval for the proposed membership of the Technical Committee on Tax and Payments to Governments, as well as the Code of Conduct, assuming that this will be relatively easy to get through, and then importantly also have our last session number 7 for today, as we have already observed that there was no any other business. So I'm proposing to move now to item 4 in session 5, the proposed membership for the GRI Technical Committee on Tax and Payments to Government.
Thank you. Please go ahead with that.
Yeah. So the background, and that was also summarized in the paper that you have received, item 4, is we've continued to the discussions and research on this particular project. As you know, it's a wide field and a range of perspectives that we need to consider here. It's also a highly political discussion, I think, at the moment. We are all aware of recent developments. One thing that we have noted in discussing with stakeholders is that there is a particular constituency or perspective, I would say, not necessarily constituency, that is lacking from our current technical committee. And that is the perspective of the professional service provider, which plays an arguably very important role in this particular issue. Tax structure, tax strategy is to a not insignificant part defined by professional service providers. And we, upon review of the literature and many background conversations, feel that it would be helpful to add a person with this particular perspective. What we've done in preparation for this proposal is we've been in touch with Accountancy Europe, who is running a working group that is focused on tax policy. They have a tax policy group, so it's the professional the certified accountants of Europe in their umbrella organization on the European level that have a group, and the chair of this group is available to join our technical committee. And we are putting forward to the GSB today to add this person in question, Elko van der Ende, to the technical committee to have this perspective covered going forward. And we had background conversations with him, have a positive confirmation from him that he understands the terms of reference for the group and the project scope and also the way GRI develops standards, and feel comfortable that he is a good addition to the group. I want to open for questions at this stage, if any, and otherwise move to approval for this addition to the membership.
Any questions?
We have Evan Harvey strongly supporting this. I think this relates to, and also Michelle Washer agreeing with the recommendation. And we have Kent with a question.
Yeah, so I'd like to just speak to this for a moment. You know, back when we were talking about who the members of this technical committee would be, and I had a long conversation with Chelsea about it. You know, we did have a long discussion about the fact that there were not any members of these large public accounting firms involved, and how important that would be. At the time, you know, Chelsea said, well, they don't want to be involved because there's conflicts of interest with their clients. And so I'm hugely. I'm surprised and pleased to find out that somebody from Price Waterhouse is willing to serve on this committee. I think that it adds a lot of credibility because ultimately, these tax calculations, they're really they're highly technical, and they happen within these accounting firms. And so having somebody as a representative from these firms, I think, is really, really a huge step in the right direction. In addition to that, that's where all the technical expertise is on these issues. It's within these big firms. So once you have somebody from Price Waterhouse on this technical committee, that also brings all the resources that Price Waterhouse, a multinational public accounting firm, all their technical resources. So I think this is, I was surprised, but very happily surprised about this addition, and I fully support it.
Judy, we have also agreement from Julia on that point, and Kirsten asked who is the GSSB sponsor. Kent is the GSSB sponsor for this, and he's working with us on it. Just to reflect on Kent's comment, I think I would also like to highlight that the person that we are proposing here has the backing of the Board of Accountancy Europe, which is important because he's while he is acting in an individual capacity, has also the background and perspective of the industry, at least on the European level, and it is, to my knowledge, still the largest accountancy membership body globally that we have here, and it is important. I think that they can reflect on global as well as European practice, and he has also ties into that membership organization to bring them to this process. I think in light of our public consultation requirement, that is also a very important element.
This is Dwight. I have no problem with somebody with these kind of qualifications being on this committee, which is dealing with tax policy. So that's not a problem at all. I do not have access to the entire proposal electronically right now, and I'm wondering if you could read the categories of the members. I don't need to know their names, just to see what the balance is like.
So yes, currently already confirmed, we have a labor representative, we have 2 persons from a multinational with tax responsibility, heads of tax departments. We have a civil society organization, the Tax Justice Network. We have an academic who has been spearheading the development of country-to-country reporting. Made recommendations from an investor perspective on tax reporting, as well as an investment officer from the US. And it would be in that context that we're adding, for us, it's a mediating institution addition to the group, so a second person from the mediating institution.
Well, again, I don't have any problem with either the category or the name that you are proposing, but I am looking at the balance, and I'm a little disturbed in the sense that I see basically one civil society organization that is interested in what the social impact is of this kind of reporting. And I'm assuming the labor would also be a second, but I don't think that's enough, to be honest with you, with the kind of balance. And I think you need to either trim back or you need to find somebody else that is concerned with the impact on society of tax issues. I'm not sure why you have 2 investors. I don't get that.
So Dwight, this has already been approved, this slate. So we're really just discussing this addition, and it was on the explicit request of the GSB that we have these investor slots. For maybe just for clarification, yes, indeed, we have just one civil society representative, but the broader transparency agenda that is probably carried by the Tax Justice Network is also reflected in the expertise of our academic on the group. He has done lots of work in that space. So at the time, there was no issue with that slate. If it is indeed a belief held by the full group that there is an additional member needed from civil society, we also we're close to 10 members then again, so it's becoming a larger group. I think we can go back, but this process has also started, and the first meeting is in January. So I cannot confirm right now that we will be able to find another person. We have gone through quite a diligent process in identifying the members that we currently have.
Well, yeah, my point is this, though. If you propose to add an additional person, then it is all right to look at the whole balance and see what the additional person does to the character of the group. And then it's all right to go and look and say, well, do you need this many people from that aspect? And so that's my only point. Now, I understand that we've moved quite a long way, and I assume that you've identified the individuals and we've approved them, but I am a little concerned about the balance of the group. And
Dwight, if I may, I believe we did that in September when we looked at the balance and the overall membership of the group and asked the Standards Division if they could seek an additional person from a significant accountancy background. That was felt at the time to be the one area of kind of lack of perspective. We did also have a lengthy discussion about the adequacy of the representation across other stakeholder categories as well at that time, including the civil society side of things. So I'm surprised to hear it raised again at this point, given that this latest edition only happened as a result of the GSSB being happy with the slate in its entirety, apart from the feeling that there was this one absent. I do think that the process has been a very lengthy and quite involved one in order to find the right slate of people to be involved in it. And I think at this point, if we were to go back and say we need to reconsider numbers here, then we would be really, I mean, I think the January meeting would be imperiled. I don't think it would actually happen at this point.
Okay.
Judy, to support you there, unfortunately, one aspect that we see is there are certain interest groups who's got a huge interest in forwarding these standards and the work of the GRI. And I'm taking the occupational health and safety standard, where we had absolutely a tremendous interest in it. There are others who want to be involved, but they just don't care to respond or get involved in it. And we can't force them. And that's the dilemma that we sit within at the end of the day. And I fully respect Dwight's comments on this, but in some way, we need to find a way to encourage those who are not willingly participating or want to participate and spend time to do so for the better cause.
Judy,
I appreciate what was said, Judy, and also what was just said. And what I might suggest is we might, after the work of this technical committee is done, we might have a sort of as we've done in other committees, to have some of the other people comment on the work a little bit and provide us advice. I'm just concerned.
Yeah.
I'm concerned that the people with tax avoidance as an issue may not be enough of them. That was my only point. But I certainly wouldn't want to imperil the meeting in January, and it's not necessary to readjust the balance, I think.
Thank you very much for that, Dwight.
Judy?
Okay. Yeah.
May I suggest that we move to then approval for this specific proposal, and then go to the actually last session that we have scheduled, looking at time. We skip the code of conduct discussion, and we move to the celebratory part of farewell of departing GSSB members.
Okay, unless there are any objections to that on the part of the other GSSB members, then that is exactly what I will do at this point. The final scheduled item on our agenda is to ensure that it is fully in the public record how grateful the GSSB is to its departing members at this point. We have Stian van Draag and we have Daniel Taillant, who will be leaving us at the, well, this is their final meeting. They'll be leaving us formally at the end of 2017. And we have two wonderful new members who will be joining us. But both Stian and Daniel have been involved with the GSSB from the beginning, and indeed from long before the beginning on the Technical Advisory Committee. They have both been very reliable and dedicated voices, very effective, and I am personally grateful to both of them for the diligence that they've shown and for the contributions that they have made. And I would like to ask my fellow GSSB members to join me in expressing our gratitude to them on our own behalf, and wishing them all the very best in their future endeavors. And I do hope that we will be keeping in touch with them and hearing about all of their next adventures.
Fully supported, absolutely.
We have support from Kirsten and Michelle in the chat box as well.
Of course.
And support from me.
Of course, of course.
And Attila is here and support from here as well.
Excellent. Well, can I ask for any? I'm afraid we're not able to get to our any other business at the end of this agenda today. But we have a number of to-dos that have come out of this meeting to be getting on with in the next couple of weeks, and then as we won't be speaking again before the end of the year, it's just remains for me to wish everyone all the best for any forthcoming holidays that you might be celebrating, and for the turn of the year, and best wishes in 2018. And I look forward to our next meeting then.
Thank you very much. Likewise.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Judy.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Happy holidays.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.